But let's talk about our plan for today. So this is a free prep hour, which is kind of a cool way to sample Manhattan Prep's teaching style and also to get some free LSAT prep in. If you are looking for more options for studying the LSAT for free, we offer free session ones for any of our LSAT courses. So we have 10-session LSAT courses located in most major cities and also hosted online on a regular basis. And you can come to any of those first sessions, which is a 3-hour class that focuses on logical reasoning and logic games for free with no obligation to sign up for the full course. So that's an even more awesome way to get a sense of what our teaching is like and get a little bit of free LSAT help. We also have a great online tool called LSAT Interact, which has a bunch of interactive videos where it'll teach you some LSAT content and then kind of quiz you on it, and based on your responses, it will give you adaptive feedback. So kind of the next best thing to actually having an instructor present in the room. So definitely check those things out if you're looking for more ways to study for free, or if you're exploring your course and tutoring options. So today's lesson is going to focus on a concept that is present in a lot of the LSATs called conditional logic, what we think of as formal logic. It's a concept that is heavily used in logic games, and that is also heavily used in logical reasoning, and it looks a little bit different in each of those. We're going to start today by learning some basics of conditional logic, and then we're going to talk about a particular basic of conditional logic called the contrapositive. And then we're going to focus in particular on how conditional logic is used in the logical reasoning section. But what we learn about conditional logic in the first and second parts of the lesson are also going to be really, really useful to your work on logic games. So conditional logic is a certain type of thinking that is all about requirements and guarantees. The statement here is a classic example of a conditional logic statement. If I am in Canada, then I am in North America. What makes this conditional logic is we have a condition, the if statement, that guarantees that a certain outcome will happen. We have a 100% chance that I am in North America. We call this condition the sufficient, and we call this outcome the necessary. Anytime that you have a statement where you can turn it into an if-then statement, that one circumstance is always going to trigger a particular outcome, then you are in the world of conditional logic. And that's really helpful to know because it means that you can do certain types of thinking and diagramming that might be useful to you. So how do we know we're in the world of conditional logic? Well, the first way is we might just see an if-then statement. That's most likely to happen in a logic game scenario. So there's an entire type of logic games that we call in and out grouping, where all of the rules are going to be an if-then statement like this one. You will also see statements that have a strong guaranteed relationship, but that aren't worded with the if-then. So for example, every shopper who spends over $100 will receive a prize ticket. This uses language that 100% guarantees if you are a shopper who spends this much, you will receive a prize ticket. I know it's conditional logic because I could turn it into a guaranteed if-then statement. If you spend over $100, then you receive the prize ticket. The language that you see in number 2 is what you're more likely to see in logical reasoning. So less likely to see conditional logic jumping out as this if-then, and more likely to just see some really strong language like every, will, always, that type of thing. You'll also see on logical reasoning conditional logic presented as a requirement. So you'll see this is what needs to happen. Other language they'll use would be this is what must happen. This is the only way that something can happen, or this is a precondition. Anytime that you see any of this language, you are in conditional logic territory. And it's important to your LSAT studying that you learn to recognize it. So on logic games, you want to know that the if-then is conditional logic and that you might then be able to write it in a certain way. On logical reasoning, you want to know that these strong words and requirement words signal conditional logic. The first thing that happens for most people is they see conditional logic and there's sort of a shorthand way of jotting it down. And that involves just using an arrow. So you say, if Tom, okay, I'm going to put T for Tom, then Vivian will go to the seminar. The arrow means then. If I spend over $100, then I get the ticket, T for ticket. If I'm an applicant, then I must have a photo ID. The letters that you use to represent these ideas might be different than the ones that we have here. Some people find it tricky and kind of more confusing to use a letter rather than the words. So you might be the person who says like, I don't want to write T, then V, I want to write like Tom, then Vivian, and that's fine. But the concept is that you can replace the word then with this arrow to set up a diagrammed conditional logic statement, which is helpful when you have to make inferences based off of these statements, or if you have to connect them together, which is what we're going to start talking about now. All right, so one of the things that the LSAT will test you on is if I am given a conditional statement like this one, what else can I logically infer based on that statement? So I'm going to ask you all to take a look at these three possible inferences that someone might try to make based off the statement. If I am in Canada, then I am in North America. And I want you to decide if each of them is a good inference or a bad inference. Once you've decided for all three, go ahead and send me a private message in the chat letting me know what you think. So just put number 1, good or bad, number 2, number 3. You can make it a private chat by changing the 2 to just say my name, Allison Bell, if you want it just to be me that sees it and not everyone. I'm going to pause myself for a minute and give you about a minute to do this and send me your answers. Okay, let's talk through these. So let's take a look at the first one. If I am not in Canada, then I am not in North America. Does that have to be true? If I'm not in Canada, is there anywhere else I could be that would still be in North America? Tell me in the chat. Where else could I be? I'm not in Canada, but I'm still in North America. I'm like Carmen Sandiego. Where am I? Cool. Yeah, maybe I'm in the United States. Maybe I'm in Mexico. So it doesn't have to be true based off of the information that we've been given that if I'm not in Canada, I am not in North America. So I would say that the first one, and the LSAT would agree, is a bad inference. This is an example of what we call an illegal negation. Check out the relationship between this bad inference and our original statement, which was true. If I am in Canada, I'm definitely in North America. So this was true, but just because this was true didn't end up meaning that this was true. This is a mistake that the LSAT wants you to make sometimes. They will give you a conditional statement, and then they will invite you to make the mistake of thinking the negation is true. This is also a mistake that people make when they're creating arguments sometimes. They will say, okay, if this is true, then the negation of it must also be true. It's possible in some situations for you to have a conditional statement and to coincidentally have the negation of it be true, but it's not an inference that you can trust. So when you see this on the LSAT, you want to say, no, I can't infer this. This is logically invalid. This is a problem. On a logical reasoning question, the way this might present itself is they might give you this statement as one part of an argument, and then they might conclude this negation off of the premise that if I'm in Canada, then I'm in North America. And you would have to say, oh, no, that's not right. The problem with that argument is it's making an illegal negation. In logic games, what's more likely to happen is they'll give you a statement and you have to make sure that you don't accidentally illegally negate that statement when you're coming up with your own inferences. All right, the second statement, if I am in North America, then I'm in Canada. Everybody wrote in that is a bad inference, and I agree. It's a bad inference for the same reason that number one is. I could be in North America, but be in the United States or Mexico. Notice, though, that the formal relationship between this and our true statement up here is a little bit different than number one. We've taken the C and the N and we have reversed them. So this is an example of an illegal reversal, which is also a logical flaw. It is something that you cannot do on the LSAT. You cannot take a statement like this and then come to this conclusion off the basis of that. So as most of you said, the only one that is a good inference is number 3 here. If I am not in North America, then I'm not on this continent. There's no way for me to be in Canada. Statement number 3 is what we call the contrapositive of the original statement. Take a moment to look at how the original statement is set up and what did they do to the terms in order to create the contrapositive. If you can tell me what happened to get from here to here, say it in the chat window. Nice, Tom. They reversed them and they made it a negative. So the valid move that you can make anytime that you have a conditional statement is you can reverse and negate. That will create the contrapositive, which is always also going to be true. If this statement is true, then reversing and negating it will also be true as long as I'm dealing with conditional logic. This is a huge thing on the LSAT. On logic games, there are going to be a lot of inferences that you can make. If you remember, every time I write conditional logic, I should also create the contrapositive. On logical reasoning, there are going to be situations where you need to manipulate logic and recognize the contrapositive or use the contrapositive to fill in some sort of gap. in an argument. So you want to know this term, contrapositive. You want to know how it's made, so by reversing and negating. And you want to understand that the contrapositive is a logically valid inference that you can always make given conditional logic. I'm going to pause here for a second because these are all really important, heavily tested concepts on the LSAT. So if you have any questions or there's anything you'd like to see another example of, take a moment to let me know in the chat window. If you're all good, you can give me a smiley face in the chat and I'll know that we can move forward. Tom, this video will be available on YouTube after we're done as a recording. Cool. All right. So here's just a quick summary of the contrapositive for my visual learners out there who would like to see it this way. I'll give you a moment to process it. This is the same thing that we talked about on the last slide. If you're a note taker, this would be good stuff to write down. Okay, so I want to give you some opportunities to try this out in the same way that the LSAT will make you try it. So what I'd like for you to do is take a couple of minutes, and I want you to take each of these statements, notate it as conditional logic. So remember, that means you find some kind of shorter way to say it. I'll give you an example for the first one. So this one, if Frank is selected, then John is selected. And then I want you to also find the contrapositive of that statement. I want you to do that for all 5. That's probably a little too much for you to type in the chat window all at once. So you can just write done in the chat window when you're done, and then we'll go through them one at a time. All right, I'll give you some time. Tell me done when you are done so we can start going over it. All right, I'm starting to see some dones roll in. If you're still working, no worries. You can kind of finish this with us together as we go through. So let's start with the first one. So I notated the original. I would love to see everybody's first stab at a contrapositive. Could you please tell me in the chat window, what would you put as the contrapositive for number 1? You can use the negative sign or the word not if you need to. All right, cool. Nice work, Cindy. So if I want to write the contrapositive of this, excellent. I see a lot of awesome responses rolling in. I'm going to reverse it and negate it. So J is going to come first, but it'll be negative. And then we're going to say negative F. Sometimes it's helpful to retranslate that back into words so that you remember what you're really talking about. So this would be, so if John is not selected, then Frank must be selected, which makes sense. If Frank were selected, then John would have to be selected too. Cool. So the second one is going to be pretty similar. You just have to watch out for your nots. If Frank is selected, then we have John is not selected. So make sure you've got that negative in there. Reverse and negate. Now John is first and becomes positive. If John is selected, then now we've got negative Frank. Frank is not selected. All right, I would be really interested to see the way that you diagrammed this original statement. How did you notate number 3? Tell me in the chat. Nice. I see some excellent responses rolling in. So one of the most challenging things about this is they've moved the if. So we've gotten used to just kind of putting the first part of the sentence first, the second part of the sentence after the arrow, but that's because of the word if. The way we set up our conditional logic is we always want to take the if part of the sentence and put it on the left side of the arrow, because that's the condition or the trigger. That's what's going to make something happen. So grammatically, they kind of moved this sentence around, but that doesn't change the logic of it. I'm still going to say if Frank is not selected, so not F, then John will be selected, which means my contrapositive will be if John is not selected, then Frank is selected. Okay, number 4 is arguably the hardest one to diagram. Tell me what you got for just the first part. How would you notate number 4? Oh, cool. Okay, I see Cindy and Tom had 2 kind of different ways of saying the same thing. Tom started with the contrapositive and Cindy started with the original statement. And what's tricky about this particular sentence is the word only gets thrown in there. When we say one thing will happen only if something else happens, that's really different from saying A will happen if B happens. Only changes the whole game. So I have to think it through a little bit differently. What I know for sure is that John will be selected only if Frank is selected. So another way of saying that is the only way John gets in is if Frank gets in. I often think about this the way that Tom thought about it, which is, okay, so what if Frank doesn't get in? Then I definitely know that John is not going to get in. That's the contrapositive. I say, okay, if Frank is not selected, then John is not selected. If I take the contrapositive of that, that means that if John is selected, it has to be true that Frank was selected because that's the only way John was selected. The function of the only if is to set up the requirement or guarantee. So when you see the only if, that only if condition is going to be on the right side. It's the guarantee, the requirement, the thing that has to happen. Another way to think about this is if I say, like, I can take Chem 202 only if I've taken Chem 101. So I have, if I'm in Chem 202, then I must have taken Chem 101. But I wouldn't write it with just an if. I would write, I can take Chem 202 only if I take Chem 101. Functionally, what the only if does is basically flip the order from what it would be if you just had the word if. So if I were to take out the word only, this would be if Frank, then John, it would be F arrow J. When I add in the word only, then the order gets reversed. So slow down when you see the word only. All right, and the final one, John and Frank cannot be both selected, is a good one to challenge yourself because it doesn't actually use the word if. So it would be if John is selected, then Frank is not. And if Frank is selected, then John is not. That's our way of saying they cannot both be selected. By the way, the order doesn't matter here in terms of which did you say is the first one and which did you say is the contrapositive. The important thing is that you just end up with both of them. You want these two pieces of information, but maybe you did one first and the other one second, and that's okay. All right, I'm going to pause for questions again. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to see more examples of. I'm happy to go over any of this more than once. Okay. So what we're going to do now is take a look at how conditional logic presents itself in logical reasoning questions on the LSAT. I'm going to give you a couple of questions one at a time. I'm just going to let you try them out at first, get comfortable with them, and then we'll talk about the role that that conditional logic is playing in each of these. So I'm going to give you about 1.5 minutes to work on this question, and then when I'm done, I'll send out a poll, or when you're done, I'll send out a poll and you can tell me your answers. Okay, I'm going to send you a poll. It should pop up on your screen, and it'll give you an opportunity to tell me what answer you picked. If you haven't quite finished, that's okay, but go ahead and take your best guess as it stands. All right, awesome. Okay, so we're looking at this question through the lens of conditional logic. So there are a couple of things I want to point out about it. The first is the question type. This asks me, the conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. Does anybody know what type of question that is? Like, what would we call that? So I would call this a sufficient assumption question, which means that it's a question asking you for an answer that will 100% fill whatever gap there is in the argument. That once you pick that answer, if you plug that answer back in, the argument will be unstoppable. It's 100% true. The reason I point this out is, first, it's always important in logical reasoning to know what your job is on any particular question. It really changes the ballgame. But secondly, sufficient assumptions are one of a group of questions where you're more likely to see conditional logic, and you can use certain techniques when you do. So the questions that you're most likely to see conditional logic on include sufficient assumption questions, which is what we've got here, inference questions, which are questions that ask you, especially the ones that ask you which of the following must be true, and matching questions, those long questions where you get one argument at the top and then you have to choose between 5 arguments in the answer choices that have the same structure. So you're most likely to see conditional logic in these types of questions. And what it means when you see conditional logic is you want to kind of trigger your conditional logic knowledge. Okay, I can take contrapositives, I cannot negate the logic, I cannot reverse the logic. That should all be springing to mind. You may also find it helpful to diagram these arguments. That's totally up to you. You should do it if it helps. I'll show you how. You don't need to do it if you are able to solve the problem without diagramming. Okay, so I know from the question type that it's possible I'll see conditional logic, but I really don't know for sure until I read the actual argument. And I check to see, is it using the language of conditional logic? So can you tell me in the chat window, keeping in mind the language of the conditional logic is guarantees and absolutes and requirements. What are some words that you see in this argument that help us know it's using conditional logic? Tell me in the chat. Words in the argument that make you think, oh, maybe this is conditional. Okay, necessary is a great one, yeah. No one, it's really strong language, absolute. I'm gonna highlight these. Cannot, awesome, you're killing it, Tom. Cool. So when I see one of these in an argument, I might just be like, whatever. But when I see 3 of these in an argument, what I'm thinking is, oh, okay, so they're asking me to think about these 3 statements. How do they relate to each other in terms of conditional logic? So there's a particular strategy that you can use when you see conditional logic in these sufficient assumption questions, and I'm going to share it with you. So if you're working on a sufficient assumption question, and it has conditional logic, you can certainly just try to solve it by thinking it through, and that may be the best strategy for some folks. If you'd like a more formal strategy, there's a strategy called split the conclusion that you can use. What this means is you want to identify what the argument is claiming. So I look back and I see the word thus. That's usually kind of helpful. Murray describes him a little bit, cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator, and it's on account of his felony conviction. So we're getting a conclusion that's basically saying Murray has a felony conviction, therefore not going to be the executive administrator. So I start by kind of diagramming out the building blocks of what this argument is trying to claim. And then I'm going to take those building blocks and try to figure out how they arrived at that. So what premises help to unite that conclusion. So this is where I split the conclusion. I say, okay, this idea that he's got a felony conviction, I'm going to put that over here. How do I get from that to saying he can't have an executive administrator position? And this is where I look back at the premises that are being used to support. And I say, okay, well, what do I know based off of this? So I see a statement here, no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. Okay, so that connects to this idea of a felony conviction. How would you write that with conditional logic? No one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. Can you tell me in the chat window what's that in conditional logic? Nice, Cindy. So if you have a felony conviction, then you cannot be appointed to the board. It's going to translate into if F arrow, not B. So I know if you have a felony conviction, you're not going to be on the board. Okay. And then I get a little bit of additional information related to the board. An undergraduate degree is necessary for appointment to the executive board. Okay, so if you have an undergraduate, or if you are appointed to the executive board, then that must mean you have an undergraduate degree. Good to know, but it doesn't seem like Murray's undergraduate degree is the reason for the conclusion. They're not saying that his undergraduate degree means he can't have this position. They're saying his felony conviction is ruling him out. So if I'm trying to put together this chain, I'm saying, okay, my premises give me felony conviction means can't be on the board. But that's where the logic kind of stops. There's nothing connecting the board to the executive administrator position. So the reason this is helpful is if I can build this argument out in conditional logic and I can see where the chain breaks, there's nothing in the argument that connects this, then I have found myself an assumption. This is a missing piece of the argument that it would need in order for this conclusion to be true. So now I can take the assumption that I've found and I can predict what the correct answer is going to be. It's either going to be, if you're not on the board, then if you're not on the board, then you can't be an executive administrator. Or if you are an executive administrator, then you have to be on the board. So when I go back over to my answer choices, at first quick glance, I know I'm looking for something that links these two terms together. So they should be in the answer. On the board executive administrator. I don't see them in A. I do see them in B. I see executive administrator, but not the board in C. I see executive administrator, but not the board in D. I see executive administrator, but not the board in E. So the answer linking my argument together must be B, which is the correct answer. As I mentioned, there are other ways to arrive at this besides formal logic. So some of you may have noticed when you got to the conclusion that there was this new idea of an executive administrator, and that is often a signal of an assumption. If they bring something up in the conclusion that's totally new, you want to ask yourself, where did that come from? And usually the correct answer is going to need to sort of link that new thing back into the existing argument, which is something that B does. It links the idea of being an executive administrator back to what we know about Murray, which is that he has a felony conviction. All right, I'm going to pause for a second. I know a fair number of people chose different answers, like C was kind of popular. So if you want to talk about in more detail anything that is confusing about why C is wrong, just take a moment and let me know in the chat what you're thinking about. Okay. If there aren't any questions, then we're going to give this another go. We'll do another sufficient assumption question. You're welcome to try the diagramming strategy that we just used if you think it would be helpful. Okay, I'm going to send out a poll. Go ahead and tell me what you think. Okay, I'm seeing fewer answers this time, which might indicate that this question was a little bit more challenging. I'm going to stop the polling there and we'll work through it together. So once again, I see we have a sufficient assumption question. What's going to make the conclusion follow logically? I also see indications of conditional logic, just like I did in the last question. This is one of those rare logical reasoning questions where they actually do use an if-then statement to help us identify conditional logic. So I see an if statement, and I see an if and only if statement. So I'm going to go ahead and map this argument out. I see that my premise is this thus statement at the end. My conclusion is this thus statement at the end. Normally I would map that first, but it doesn't have the super strong conditional language of the premises. So I'm going to start with those and then see how they work with the conclusion. So the first one, I see the if is saying if it would be reasonably expected to increase the aggregate well-being of people affected by it. All right, so I'm going to shorthand this and say that the first premise is if something increases well-being, and I know that's not exactly what it says, but that's my general representation, then it's morally right. Then I get some information about it being morally wrong, and I see it's an if and only if statement. When I have an if and only if statement, I can break it up into two different ones. So if I say A, if and only if B, what that means is A if B and A only if B. So that would look like this. If the action reduces the aggregate well-being, that's our condition, then it's morally wrong. So we're going to say if it reduces well-being, then it's wrong. That's my if part. But then I also have the only if. It's morally wrong only if it reduces well-being. So if it's wrong, then that must mean that it is reducing well-being. So one thing that's good to notice on the LSAT is when you have this strong polarization between two options. It's either right or it's wrong. Here's the criteria for where it's right. Here's the criteria for where it's wrong. And then I notice that my conclusion jumps into this middle ground. Well, what if it just leaves everybody unchanged? So let's check that conclusion out. It says if it leaves the well-being unchanged, then it is right. So I'm going to map that as if the well-being is unchanged, then the action is right. And just like on the last question, I'm going to split this up and see how far I can get using my premises to try to prove it. So unchanged, how do I get from there to showing that it's right? Well, I see that if it increases well-being, that must mean that it's right. That's from my premises, so I'll put that in here. And what do I know if it's unchanged? It says if it's unchanged, so it's reasonably expected to have unchanged the aggregate. Well, if it hasn't changed it, then it hasn't made it go down. And we know that if it's wrong, it must have made the well-being go down. So if the contrapositive of that would be if it didn't make the well-being go down, it can't be wrong. So if it's unchanged, it can't be wrong according to the contrapositive. So I'm going to say, based off that inference, if it's unchanged, then it's not wrong. And if it increases the well-being, then it is right. That's all I've got, though. My chain kind of stops there. So I have this missing gap between it's not wrong and it increases well-being. What's interesting about this one is in order to prove my argument, I've got two choices. One is I can make a connection between if it's not wrong, then it has to increase well-being. I could also say, just jump straight to the end of the line. If it's not wrong, then it's right. So I'm going to pause for a second there, and there were only 2 people who polled in when we first did this, so I'm just going to give you a little bit more time to reevaluate the answers based off of that. And then tell me in the chat window what you think your answer would be when you're ready. Okay, so Tom is telling me that the answer is C. Yeah, we can go through why the other answers are wrong. So our chain of logic leads us to answer choice C, which would give us this second option for proving the argument. If it's not wrong, then it's right. So any action that is not morally wrong is morally right. If we were to plug that in, that would sort of fill the void of this argument where it's wrong or right, but what if it's in the middle? This clarifies, if it's in the middle, then it's morally right. So this is going to be our correct answer. Let's take a look at some of the other answers and see what's up with them. So answer choice A, only wrong actions would reasonably be expected to reduce the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. So that's interesting. It sounds a little bit like my premise, so I would check out the relationship between that. My premise said that if it's a wrong action, it reduces well-being, and if it's reducing well-being, it's wrong. So it sounds like answer choice A is kind of a premise booster trying to restate some information that we already got. We always rule out premise boosters on the LSAT. We don't need to prove our premises over again. We want to find something new that links them to the conclusion. Let's check out B. No action is both right and wrong. That's interesting, but it doesn't really help us solve the puzzle of these unchanged actions, which we're being told are right. This is telling us it can't be right and wrong at the same time, which is a little bit different from what we need. So we're going to cross it off. Okay. Let's look at D. There are actions that would be reasonably expected to leave unchanged the aggregate well-being of the people affected by them. That's another premise booster. We already know that those are out there because we're being told that. Our conclusion is about these actions. So we're not going to question whether or not those actions exist. So we can get rid of that. And then only right actions have good consequences is out of scope. We don't really care about the consequences. So that just leaves us with E. All right, I'll pause for a second. This is a tough question. What questions do you have? Yeah, okay, so I see Tom said, in these questions, are we just able to jump to the thus statement? So Tom, in these questions, you start with the conclusion and then build back up to it. It's possible sometimes for there to be an intermediate conclusion, and so you can't always trust that the word thus signals a conclusion. So you want to think about it, but you can start with the conclusion and use that as the basis for your work on conditional logic. Aria can definitely explain if and only if again. So let me just make some space and I'll give you a new example. So let's say Aria will attend law school if and only if she takes the LSAT. Okay, so there's two things going on here. What do I know is going to happen for sure if Aria takes the LSAT? According to this, she's definitely going to law school. But I've also got that only if. So Aria will attend law school only if she takes the LSAT. So I could really rewrite this whole sentence as two different ones, and it would mean the same thing grammatically. She will attend law school if she takes the LSAT. And then I have another sentence, Aria will attend law school only if she takes the LSAT. And all that I've done in my original sentence is combine these two ideas together. She will attend law school if and only if she takes the LSAT. So if I've combined them together, I can separate them back out. I already diagrammed the first one. If she takes the LSAT, she will go to law school. Then she will attend law school only if she takes the LSAT. So that's our only if, which remember triggers the necessary condition. So if she goes to law school, then it's necessary that she takes the LSAT. What we end up with is LSAT, then law school, and law school, then LSAT, which is what we call a biconditional. The arrow goes in both directions. In fact, I could even rewrite this as something that just has an arrow pointing both ways. I usually write it all separately because I find that less confusing. Okay, so if you see if and only if, it triggers a biconditional, which means that the logic works in both directions. Let me know if you have more questions based off that. Okay. If not, we're gonna talk a little bit about wrapping this up. So we're getting close to the end of our time together. It's been a pleasure to work with all of you. If you're interested in trying one of our courses, remember you can try the first session of an in-person or online course for free. You can sign up and see our schedule at the website. If you have anything you'd like to discuss further with me about the LSAT, I'll share my email address with you. It's abell@manhattanprep.com. And you are welcome to email me. I'll stick around for a couple of minutes. If you have any just more general LSAT related questions that you'd like to throw at me, you can put them in the chat. If you are satisfied, you don't have any more questions, then you are free to go and have a lovely evening. That's awesome, Tom. Sounds great. Do you have any questions about it? So Krista, I am not a great example. I didn't really study much for the LSAT. I borrowed my friend's books and took a couple practice tests and kind of studied for like 2 weekends and then got a 178. And I attribute that to the fact that I did debate in high school. So I was really comfortable with logic. That's kind of my strong suit. But my story is really different from most people. I have lots of students who are successful on the LSAT who follow a comprehensive course of study. So in general, what people find successful is using practice tests to figure out what areas they need to spend the most time on, taking the time to intentionally and deeply master the content that they need to cover, and then creating a strong cycle of assessing themselves and then learning the new skills and then assessing themselves frequently. That's what I did, but just kind of a mini version of it that was obnoxiously successful, but not a great general template for studying. Tom, to prepare for the course, I would recommend starting by taking a practice test. You can download the June 2007 test for free on our website. Once you've taken it, you could email your instructor, and it's just going to be their name at manhattanprep.com. And ask them to take a look at your practice test and give you some feedback. But what I would look for is, are there any areas within the practice test that are significantly weaker for you than other areas? And if there are, I would start working through the strategy guides for that particular area in advance. Other questions? You're welcome. It was nice to meet you. Cool. All right, I'm going to hop off then. Best of luck with your studying, everybody.